The Colonial Heritage, England and the Puritans, Lecture 3. In this lecture, I begin the first of two lectures that are specifically on Chapter 2 of the first part of Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. And this is the edition I use. It's published by Hackett, and it's translated by Stephen Grant. If a number of you have the University of Chicago edition, which is translated by Harvey Mansfield and Delba Winthrop, if you have the Mansfield and Winthrop edition of Tocqueville, which is much thicker because it's complete, this is an abridgment. If you have the Mansfield translation, there is a document in the syllabus module within the course content on Brightspace that gives you the equivalent page numbers for the Mansfield edition. If you have any edition other than this one or the Mansfield edition, then I can't tell you what the page numbers are. You should really rely on either the Mansfield or the Grant editions. So Tocqueville, this reading, we get to the second. Remember, I talked about how the American founding has kind of three major sources. You have the English political heritage, which I talked about in the previous lecture. You have the experience of colonial self-government, which is what the Tocqueville reading concerns, and you have the political philosophy of John Locke, which we've already gone through. So let me say something, though, because we're not reading primary sources from the Puritans, and the focus is really on the Puritans. Tocqueville argues that they were the most influential, politically speaking, of the colonists. But I wanted to say a little bit about Tocqueville, because this book, it's called Democracy in America. So Alexander de Tocqueville was a Frenchman. He was born right around 1800, I think, or so. And so he came from an aristocratic family, but obviously grew up in post-revolutionary France. And he came to America for about 9 months in the early 1830s. And during that time, he studied American life. He went up and down the East Coast. He went out into the territories. He went all around. And the main reason why was because, and you can read his introduction if you want. I don't assign it, but you can see what he's up to if you read the introduction in Democracy in America, which is included in this edition. And the basic story is that Tocqueville believed that at least the nations of Western Europe, and also the United States and Canada and such things, but that he really believed that the nations of Western Europe, at least, and perhaps all of Europe, would inevitably become democracies. And by democracy, Tocqueville does not mean, in the first place, elections. A lot of times when people think about democracy, what they tend to think of are elections and human rights or something like that. But for Tocqueville, when Tocqueville talks about democracy, he's really using a broader, almost sociological understanding that for him, a democratic society is a society that operates on the premise that all citizens are basically equal, that they are legally equal, that they have equal rights, that they have more or less equal privileges. So a democratic society is a society whose fundamental principle is not freedom, not elections, but equality of status. And obviously the big contrast for Tocqueville was with aristocracy, because as I talked about in a previous lecture, in an aristocratic society, it's very hierarchical, and the hierarchy is set by birth. You have a small number of families with great wealth and privilege and rights, and that wealth and privilege and those rights are passed on hereditarily from generation to generation. And they're basically, these nobles are the ones who are in charge. And then there's everybody else, commoners and peasants and the like, who, in a lot of places really have very little actual political power. But your status in society is set by birth. If you're not born an aristocrat, you're probably not going to become one. If you're born a peasant, you're going to die a peasant. As I sometimes say, the basic principle of an aristocratic society is you are what your father was, and your son will be what you are. Your status, oftentimes even your occupation, is passed on hereditarily. And so the interesting thing about Tocqueville is, of course, that Europe at the time that he was writing had no democracies. Really, America was the only democracy, yet he was convinced that European countries would become more democratic over time, even though they were still basically aristocracies. And the reason why, and again, you can read the introduction, is that when he looked at the course of European history, basically from the Middle Ages to his own time, what he saw was a gradual process where the hierarchies in society were being leveled over time. So there's a process of leveling going on. And the natural end result of that leveling is a democratic society where everybody has equal status. Um, but Tocqueville thought that democracy was ambiguous. He thought that a society based on equal status could be really good if it's a free society. But he also, as we'll see later in the course, foresaw that democracy opens the opens the way to almost a new kind of despotism, a new kind of tyranny. Roughly what we kind of think of when we talk about totalitarianism, a society where, yes, everybody may be equal, but they are all subject to a very powerful government that regulates their lives in many and differing ways. So Tocqueville thought that the trend towards democracy could open up opportunities for greater human freedom, or it could open up opportunities for a new form of basically slavery. So Tocqueville was very much concerned that if democratization was going to be inevitable, he wanted it to be the good kind of democracy and not the bad kind. And so he came to America to study America because he thought, well, in the United States, unlike in Europe, the United States, they have been a democracy in his time for, 50 years, 40, 50 years. And they're doing okay. They're a prosperous society. They're a pretty stable society. So he thought, I'm going to go to America and I'm going to study how they make democracy work. And not because he wanted to study it just for its own sake, but in order to draw lessons from the American experience that could be applied in Europe, so that as Europe went democratic, it could adopt some of the more successful democratic practices that exist in America. Because obviously, being a Frenchman, Tocqueville, his family and everybody in France in the 1830s still remembered the French Revolution, that, in 1789, France itself tried to become a democratic republic, and it ended up descending into a reign of terror, a horrible period that eventually was put to an end through the ascent of Napoleon and, in effect, the reinstitution of monarchy. So France had a very bad experience with the attempt to go democratic. Tocqueville was very concerned with drawing whatever lessons he could from American experience in order to help Europeans, and especially Frenchmen, do a better job of becoming democratic in the future. So that was really the motivation for democracy in America. And it's not that Tocqueville universally praises America. He's actually very critical of many aspects of American and democratic society. And if you ever have a chance to read the entire book, it's a fascinating book where he covers all aspects of American culture. And it's really remarkable, all the things he talks about, and a number of the things. He doesn't get everything right, but a number of things that still seem true to this day. Well, I think one of the funniest observations I always think of with Tocqueville is that he talks about, he says, Americans are really patriotic. They really love their country. And that's fine. Most people love their country. But the thing that's really annoying about Americans is that they praise America and they want you to praise America too, right? Even if you're not an American. So they're constantly trying to make me praise America, and it was kind of irksome to him. And I think probably a number of people from, either visitors or immigrants from other countries have probably experienced that with Americans, the way that Americans seem almost aggressively proud of America. So that's the purpose of democracy in America and Tocqueville's purpose. So now we are, this lecture, this is the first of two, is a lecture on chapter 2 of part 1 of Democracy in America. And that chapter 2 is entitled The Point of Departure and Its Importance for the Future of the Anglo-Americans. And kind of the main assertion at the beginning of this comes in the middle of page 17, where he says, when, after having studied attentively the history of America, its political and social state is examined with care, one feels profoundly convinced of this truth, that there is not an opinion, not a habit, not a law, I might say not an occurrence, that the point of departure does not explain without difficulty. So in other words, what he says is, if you understand how the colonies were established, who founded them, So if you understand how the colonies got started, you will have the key to understanding the American national character up through the present day. Now, he actually starts with a kind of interesting analogy where he says, if you want to understand a person's character, sometimes we'll look back to like their adolescence, right, their formative years, see like, well, what made this person the kind of person they are. And Tocqueville says, but really, I think, really what you have to understand is their very first experiences as a baby. And that oftentimes the kind of personality and temperament that a person's going to have was fixed very, very early on by their very earliest experiences in infancy, right? Which sounds like kind of like a modern psychological observation. And he says the same thing is really true for nations. That if you want to understand the character of a particular nation, usually what you have to understand is how they got started, because for the most part, how they got started kind of sets their character in most ways. He says the problem is that with most nations, they started so long ago in the mists of time that we don't really have any accurate history. We can't look back to there because there are no accurate historical records. One of the great advantages, he says, of the Anglo-Americans in North America is that, the colonies were founded in modern times when you did have accurate historical records. So in the case of the United States, you can actually look at the very beginnings of the society for clues to understanding the American national character. So the way the chapter works is he kind of narrows in. He begins by talking about what all of the colonial settlers in the future United States had in common. So from, in effect, Maine, which was Massachusetts at the time, all the way down to Georgia. So he starts with what all the colonists had in common. And then from there, he makes a distinction between the North and the South, and he talks about the kind of primary reasons why the northern and the southern colonies are different from one another. And then he focuses in on New England in the North, the Puritan colonies, because he believes that when it comes to political principles, it really was the New England colonies that were the most influential in American development. The kind of the guiding ideas and principles of American politics were most perfectly realized in New England and kind of spread from there through the rest of the country. And then what he does is he talks about what made the Puritans unique. And then he talks about the particular way in which they had, on the one hand, an extremely democratic form of political life, combined with an almost fanatical religious life, which might seem kind of paradoxical. They were total religious dogmatists, and at the same time, they were extremely innovative in politics. So how did this political freedom and this kind of like religious fundamentalism, how do these two things work? And he ends with a general reflection on the way that religion and freedom, free politics, kind of actually reinforce one another in the United States instead of being in conflict. So the discussion of the innovative political institutions and the relationship between religion and politics will be in the next lecture. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to talk about his account of what the settlers all had in common, the distinction between the North and the South, and the unique character of the Puritans. So remember, the United States colonies were to a large extent settler colonies. That is, people came there to stay. A number of them did. And he lays out on pages 17 and 18 a number of things, what he calls common traits that all the settlers had in common. He says, the tie of language is perhaps the strongest and most durable that can unite men. All the immigrants spoke the same language. They were all children of a single people, born in a country, agitated for centuries by party conflict, right, the conflict in English politics, and where the faction had been obliged, each in their turn, to place themselves under the protection of the laws. Their political education occurred in this rough school, and one saw spread among them more notions of rights and more principles of true liberty than among most of the peoples of Europe. So that's the English political heritage that I talked about in the previous lecture. At the same time, the first emigrations, municipal government, that fertile germ of free institutions, had already penetrated deeply into English habits, and with it the dogma of the sovereignty of the people had been introduced into the very heart of the Tudor monarchy. Now, by that he means municipal government. He means like local government at the township level. And so his point is that, England already had a relatively strong tradition of local government. So that tradition of local government is carried over into the colonies. And he says, and with it, the idea of the sovereignty of the people. And by sovereignty of the people, the notion that the ultimate source of political authority is not the king, the ultimate source of political authority is not the aristocrats, the ultimate source of political authority is the people. And he says, the kind of the local governments in the colonies were really kind of built on this principle of the sovereignty of the people. And then he goes on to say, at that time, Europe was in the midst of the religious conflicts that shook the Christian world, the kind of the effects of the Reformation. England had rushed with a sort of fury into this new course. The character of the inhabitants, which had always been solemn and thoughtful, had become austere and argumentative. Right? Education had increased greatly during these intellectual conflicts. In them, the mind had received a more profound culture. And while the nation had been busy talking about religion, morals had become purer. All of these general traits of the nation reappeared more or less in the physiognomy of those of its sons who had come to search for a future on the opposite shore of the ocean. So in other words, there were a lot of things that all the settlers had in common. They had in common the English language, which made it possible for a sense of kind of American peoplehood. They had the English political heritage, importance of rule of law and of individual rights, and also the principle of local government and popular sovereignty. And they had a very kind of severe religious education. They were generally kind of highly educated, and they were kind of pretty moral or moralistic people. So that was true to a certain extent throughout all the colonies. And then he adds two things to this, two general New World factors about the New World in North America that were very important for American political development. And the first one was that the settlers who came to the United States were relatively equal to one another in status at the time. That back in Europe, you had this hereditary aristocracy where you had a very steep social hierarchy. But you don't have the same steepness of the social hierarchy in the United States, primarily because not many aristocrats came over. So as he says in the next paragraph on page 18, it says, one additional observation to which we will have occasion to return later is not only applicable to the English, but also to the French and the Spanish and all the Europeans who came to settle successively on the shores of the New World. All the new European colonies contained, if not the development, at least the germ of a complete democracy. So in other words, a society based on equal status. It says two causes led to this result. One can say that in general, on departing the mother country, the emigrants had no idea of any superiority whatsoever of some of them over the others. Now that's an exaggeration, but see what he has to say. It was scarcely the fortunate and powerful who emigrated. And poverty as well as misfortune are the best guarantees of equality that we know of among men. So basically this idea that for the most part, it wasn't the rich and powerful that came over to the New World because they were doing fine back home. It was people of kind of lower status. So you had quite a bit of equality among these relatively lower status emigrants. Now, as he goes on to say, on several occasions, however, it happened that some great lords went to America as a result of political or religious conflicts. They made laws there in order to establish the hierarchy of ranks, but it was soon evident that American soil absolutely rejected territorial aristocracy. In other words, and this is the second point, you did have some aristocrats who came over to the United States, and they did try to reintroduce aristocracy in the United States to create, titles of nobility, where you have a relatively small number of titled people who have all the political power, who own vast tracts of land, and everybody else lives kind of in subjection to them. But his point is, it didn't work. Right? As he goes on to say, it was obvious that in order to clear this wild terrain, nothing less was needed than the constant and involved efforts of the proprietor himself. And after the ground was prepared, it was found that its products were in no way great enough to enrich at the same time a master and a tenant farmer. Thus, the terrain was broken up naturally into small domains that the proprietor cultivated alone. Now, it is the land which interests aristocracy. It is the soil to which it is attached and on which it leans for support. It is not privileges alone that establish it. It is not birth which constitutes it, but property in land transmitted by inheritance. Right. So owning an estate that is hereditarily transmitted to your descendants That's what the political privileges are tied to. That's what makes you an aristocrat. And it just didn't work in the United States. In the United States, people had to work hard to make the land fertile and prosperous. And the way you would do that is by basically breaking up the land so that people work their own land, so that you incentivize them, right? That peasants who work for a feudal lord, who therefore do not get to keep a lot of their own produce, are not incentivized to work very hard. But when you own your own land, then you get to keep any gain that you make from it. And so that will incentivize people to work harder. So in America, to really be prosperous, you had to let people be kind of independent property owners. Or big territorial aristocracy like you had in Europe really didn't work very well. As he notes, it was a little bit different in the South, because in the South you did have plantations, but it didn't form the basis for an aristocratic society, because instead of the Southern plantation owners having a large number of, kind of tenant farmers and peasants who relied upon them, they owned slaves, and the slaves did a lot of the work, and that did not convey the same kind of status. So the wealthy plantation owners were still commoners. They weren't titled aristocrats and all of that. So the significant equality of the immigrants to the United States and the inability to establish territorial aristocracy in the United States meant that, in effect, for Tocqueville, America was destined to become a democratic society, one where citizens were marked by basically equal status. There were inequalities of wealth, there were inequalities of education, there were definitely elites who were oftentimes very much the ones in charge in the colonies. But nonetheless, it's the case that you didn't have anything like the fixed and kind of like immobile and steep social hierarchy that you have in aristocratic countries. And if you are English or you've been to England, you know people from England, they can tell you that, there might be inequality in America, but it does not match the kind of class system that you still find in places like England, where you did have some history of aristocracy. Okay, so having talked about the traits that the colonists had in common and the fact that they lived in a country that, in effect repelled the establishment of territorial aristocracy, he goes on really at the bottom of page 18 and the top of page 19 to talk about the difference between the North and the South. Because although all the colonists had certain things in common, it was still the case that the North and the South were quite different from one another. And here's how he describes it at the top of page 19. Virginia received the first English colony. Immigrants arrived there in 1607. Europe at this time was still singularly preoccupied with the idea that gold and silver mines constituted the riches of peoples, a disastrous idea that has done more to impoverish the European nations that have abandoned themselves to it and destroyed more men in America than war and all bad laws together. It was thus gold seekers who were sent to Virginia. Right? If you've seen the Disney cartoon Pocahontas, it kind of parodies this. Gold seekers, men without resources and manners, whose restless and turbulent spirit troubled the infancy of the colony and made its progress uncertain. Then manufacturers and farmers arrived, a more moral and calmer race. But in almost no respect did it stand higher than the inferior classes of England. No noble thought, no spiritual system governed the founding of the new establishment. Scarcely had the colony been created when slavery was introduced. This was the crucial fact that would exercise an immense influence on the character, the laws, and the whole future of the South. Right, so in other words, the South, not to put too fine a point on it, was settled by largely ignorant and greedy gold diggers with little regard for principles. Right, it was a get-rich-quick scheme for the poor and the desperate, largely. And then slavery was introduced, and slavery had its own bad effects. As Tocqueville says, slavery, as we will explain later, dishonors work. It introduces idleness into the society, and with it ignorance and pride, poverty and luxury. It enervates the powers of intelligence and weakens human activity. The influence of slavery combined with the English character explains the mores and the social state of the South. End of quotation. Right. So you have settlers who are of kind of relatively low social status and relatively low moral character, and then you have the institution of slavery, which creates a kind of idleness, contempt for work, pride, and all of that. So he basically says, if you want to understand the character of the South, just take Englishmen and give them the institution of slavery. And that's what a Southerner is. It's an Englishman in a slave economy. And this was not the case in New England. Now, it's important to note that slavery, all the way up through the time of the adoption of the Constitution, slavery of some form or another was legal and practiced in every single colony. But in the northern colonies, where you didn't have the large plantations, even though slavery existed, it was not particularly significant. It did not have a big influence on the development of political systems because it was not an economically significant practice, whereas slavery was so economically central to the South that it had a massive effect on social and economic institutions. Okay, so I'm going to change a little bit the order that I said, but I'm going to end this lecture here, and in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about Tocqueville's account of the Puritans, their character, their religious character, and also their political character, leading up to his argument that it really is from the Puritans that you find this very interesting mixture of sort of democratic political principles and deep religious piety that he thinks marks the Americans especially. So that will be in the next lecture.